Just a nurse. That's what they called her, the ones who noticed her at all. Natalie Hayes moved through Seattle General's ICU in Norfolk like a woman trained to disappear, shoulders forward, eyes down, never lingering long enough to become a fixture. 2 years. 24 months of perfect invisibility. She'd been invisible before, of course. That was the whole point. The Pentagon had made her invisible once already, and she'd gotten very good at the second time around. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she pushed through the double doors at 5:19 a.m., badge clipped to her scrub pocket, hair in a regulation bun so tight it pulled her face taut. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and machine oil and the particular kind of human fear that machinery can't quite mask. She breathed it in like other people might breathe in coffee. It meant she was alive. It meant nobody was asking questions. Her locker was the third one from the left in the break room. Inside, a photo of mountains she never discussed, a silver compass that hadn't pointed true in 9 years, and a pair of surgical gloves she'd been carrying since Kandahar. On the shelf above, she kept her phone powered off. No texts. No calls. No life that existed outside these walls. That was safer. Safer for her, and safer for anyone who got close enough to notice the woman underneath the scrubs. She checked her reflection in the break room mirror, not for vanity, never for that. For inventory. Dark circles under her eyes from 3 consecutive night shifts. Blonde hair so pale it was almost white. Skin that hadn't seen sunlight in 43 days because the sun required you to step outside, and outside meant being seen. Her hands looked steady in the mirror. That was good. Her hands were always steady. They'd held too many lives for them not to be. The shift change briefing started at 6:15 in conference room B and Natalie took a seat in the back corner. The night nurse, Marcus, from the trauma unit, was reviewing the census, 7 vents, 3 post-op cardiac patients, 1 GI bleed in bay for monitoring closely. The words washed over her the way they always did. She wasn't here to remember. She was here to work. Memory was dangerous. Memory led to recognition. Recognition led to questions. Questions led to the kind of answers that got people killed. At 6:33 a.m., the paramedic call came through. Incoming GSW, no, trauma alert. Male, mid-30s, found unresponsive behind O'Malley's, the Veterans Bar on 15th. Multiple lacerations. Blunt force trauma to the thorax. Suspected tension pneumothorax. ETA for minutes. Natalie's hands moved before her mind caught up. She was already on her feet, already moving toward Bay 2, already pulling the emergency cart into position. The ventilator was primed. The suction was live. The defibrillator pads were in the drawer. Her body knew this choreography better than it knew how to breathe. The ambulance doors burst open at 6:37. The patient came in hard, pale, breathing shallow and wrong, his left lung collapsing like a building coming down. The paramedic was already talking, blunt force, multiple assailants, found unconscious, GCS-8, no ID on him, nothing but the clothes on his back. Nothing but the clothes and the ring. Natalie saw it as she cut away his shirt. Heavy gold. Military insignia. The kind of ring you didn't take off unless you were dead or they'd cut off your hand. His right hand was swelling fast, the circulation compromised, the finger turning purple at the base. She had maybe 3 minutes before necrotic tissue set in. She reached for the ring cutter, smooth, practiced movement, and felt the metal resist. These things always resisted. They were made to last. She worked the cutter around the band. Once. Twice. The metal gave way with a small metallic snap that nobody heard over the ventilator's urgent wheeze and the monitor's climbing heart rate. She removed the ring carefully, set it on the sterile field, and continued working. The swelling was bad but not irreversible. The hand would be fine. She'd seen worse. She'd seen so much worse. Then she looked at the ring. 75th Ranger Regiment crest. Clear as day. the insignia that had been stitched onto her own uniform 9 years ago, the one they'd made her take off when the operation went wrong and the Pentagon decided she needed to vanish. The one she'd spent 3 years wearing before it all fell apart in a place called Bagram. Her jaw clenched. Not a visible reaction. Just the muscles tightening beneath the skin. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. But something in her chest dropped like a stone into deep water. She logged the ring as personal effects item 1 and moved on because that was what you did. You kept moving. You kept working. You didn't let the ghost of your own past sit in the same room while you tried to save a stranger's life. The needle decompression went smooth. 14-gauge angiocath, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The hiss of air escaping the pleural cavity was almost gentle. O2 sat climbed, 68, 72, 78, 82. His color was already better. His breathing was already less desperate. By the time Dr. Pierce walked through the ICU doors at 7:04 a.m., making some loud comment about the hospital's pathetic coffee service, the Ranger's vitals were stable. Natalie was reviewing the chart when she felt Pierce pass. She didn't look up. She never looked up. He was wearing cologne that cost more than her monthly grocery budget, and his white coat was monogrammed in cursive that was probably supposed to look distinguished and probably just looked expensive. He'd walked past her 732 times in the last 2 years. She'd counted. Not because it mattered. Because counting helped her not think about the other things. Unidentified male, correct. Dr. Pierce's voice carried across the bay like he was addressing a lecture hall instead of a patient. He barely glanced at the Ranger. His attention was on his phone, his Saturday golf game no doubt, his plans for a weekend that probably involved a country club and people who didn't have to worry about paying rent. Run the standard battery. Flag for federal fingerprint check per protocol. If he's nobody, we let the system sort it out. Yes, doctor, Natalie said quietly. She'd learned her voice. Deferential. Soft. The kind of voice that made people forget you were in the room. She placed the folded flag, the one she'd found in his belongings, corners sharp as broken glass, in the property bag alongside a wallet that contained no ID, no emergency contact information, nothing that identified the man in the bed except the military tattoo on his shoulder and the ring that now sat on the sterile field in Bay 2. But that flag was wrong. Those flags were given at military funerals, when someone had already died and been honored and been put to rest. She didn't know whose funeral this one was for, but she knew that whoever had folded it with those perfect military corners had been someone this man cared about. She knew because she was carrying an identical flag in her own locker, from 3 years ago, from the operation that had ended with her classified and erased and reassigned to Norfolk as a nobody nurse in a hospital where nobody asked questions. The Ranger's breathing was steady now. The crisis had passed. By all medical measures, he would recover. His hand would heal. His ribs would mend. But nobody knew who he was, and something about that, something about a 75th Ranger sitting in a hospital bed in Norfolk with nobody to claim him, made Natalie's careful composure feel very fragile indeed. She didn't allow herself to think about why. She didn't allow herself to feel the pull of recognition, the dangerous gravity of a past that was supposed to stay buried. She documented his vitals in the chart, clear, professional, flawless, and moved on to the next patient, the next crisis, the next moment of useful invisibility. But later, at 3:02 a.m., during the quiet hours when the ICU held its breath, she would find herself looking at that ring again, at the insignia that meant someone like her had trained him, had served alongside him, had probably stood in a firefight beside him somewhere downrange. And somewhere in the building, without knowing it yet, the Ranger was already waking up, already asking the questions that would change everything. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of clinical brightness that made everything sterile and exposed. Dr. Pierce led his entourage through the ICU like a general inspecting troops, 20 residents trailing behind him in white coats, their notebooks already open, their pens poised to capture whatever wisdom fell from his mouth. The fluorescent lights caught the edge of his face, sculpting his features into something sharp and predatory. He moved bed to bed with the rhythm of a man who'd performed this ritual 1,000 times, each patient a teaching moment, each charter opportunity to demonstrate his superiority. But he slowed when he reached the ranger's room. The unidentified patient. The one still listed as John Doe pending fingerprint results that were apparently stuck somewhere in federal bureaucracy, waiting. Pierce picked up Natalie's overnight notes from the foot of the bed. He held them like evidence at a trial. "Ladies and gentlemen, gather around." His voice carried across the entire ICU ward with the weight of something that demanded attention. Nurses glanced up from their stations. One resident dropped her pen. "I want to show you something. An example of dangerously incompetent documentation." Natalie was 6 feet away, standing at the ventilator, checking the tube placement for the 100th time that morning. She didn't turn. Her hands continued their work with mechanical precision while her stomach dropped like she'd been pushed from a cliff. Pierce's voice took on the tone of a man reading a grocery list, casual, conversational, designed to make the words cut deeper by contrast. Patient presented with decreased bilateral breath sounds and subcutaneous emphysema noted at 0200 hours. He paused, sighed dramatically. "But here's what's interesting." The nurse noted these findings but didn't immediately call the attending. Didn't escalate. Just documented and moved on. He flipped a page. "This kind of YouTube nursing gets patients killed, folks. This is how you miss a tension pneumothorax until the patient is 2 minutes away from cardiac arrest." The residents scribbled notes like they were taking dictation from God himself. One of them, a thin guy with expensive glasses, kept glancing between Pierce and Natalie's back. Some people mistake confidence for competence. Pierce's voice could have cut through armor plating. Our job is to know the difference. To question. To verify. Not to trust the intuition of someone who learned critical care from instructional videos. Natalie's jaw clenched. A muscle twitched near her temple, the physical equivalent of a pressure valve venting steam. But her eye stayed fixed on a point on the wall 3 feet beyond the monitor, her face arranged in the expression of someone counting ceiling tiles. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She simply existed in the moment with the kind of trained stillness that comes from having had her entire identity erased once already. This was nothing. This was barely worth noticing. Pierce handed the chart to a resident and walked away without looking at her. The entourage followed like ducklings. But Natalie heard the resident whisper, "Is that the nurse?" and someone else say, "She documented subcutaneous emphysema." That's advanced. Which meant they'd just learned the first rule of Pierce's domain: the appearance of humiliation traveled faster than any actual fact. By 2 p.m., the damage was settled into her shoulders like a weight she'd have to carry all shift. The story was spreading. The nurse who missed a tension pneumothorax. The YouTube certification. The incompetence. Natalie stood at the third-floor vending machine, her hand steady as surgical steel, selecting black coffee, the only thing that came without requiring interaction. The machine hummed its electric prayer and released the cup with a mechanical sigh. Dr. Pierce appeared with 2 surgical interns, his voice pitched to carry through the entire corridor like a radio broadcast. "Johnson, let me give you some advice about nurse consultations." He laughed, the kind of laugh that invited everyone within earshot to join the joke. "Some nurses actually come from real programs. Actual education. Others learn from YouTube and think they're ready for critical care, and that's when mistakes happen." The interns laughed because they were young and didn't yet understand that laughing with power was the quickest way to become it. Natalie retrieved her coffee with movements that could have been performed by a robot, smooth, intentional, requiring no emotional engagement. She walked past them without changing her expression, without slowing, without the slightest acknowledgement that she'd heard anything. She was almost past him when Pierce's voice snapped out like a whip. "Oh, Hayes. Heads up." His smile was the kind of smile that preceded a wound. "Security escorts are typically reserved for staff who actually belong here. Wouldn't want anyone confused about your status." The interns exchanged glances. One of them actually looked uncomfortable. Natalie didn't turn. Didn't pause. didn't let even a half-second of reaction cross her face. She kept walking with perfect military posture, shoulders back, spine straight, the kind of bearing that came from 2 years of training yourself to be invisible in a way that had nothing to do with how quietly you moved. It had to do with controlling every muscle, every breath, every micro-expression. She made it to the stairwell before anything happened. The door closed behind her with a hydraulic sigh. The concrete walls pressed in. Only then, in the absolute privacy of that empty space, did she close her eyes. Her hand gripped the metal railing hard enough to feel the cold bite through her skin, hard enough to leave a small constellation of fingerprints in the condensation that had gathered from the temperature difference between floors. She held that grip for exactly 5 seconds. Then she released it, straightened her scrubs, and descended the stairs at a walk that betrayed nothing. By 9 p.m., Natalie was charting in the electronic system at the nurse's station, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same efficiency they used for everything else: medication drawers, patient assessments, vital sign documentation. The ICU had the kind of quiet that came at night, when most families had gone home and the monitors provided the only conversation. She was documenting the Ranger's 2100 vitals when Drive Pierce appeared beside her station like a shadow that had learned to walk. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a register that only she could hear. "I've been reviewing your application, Hayes. Your references are interesting. Almost like they don't exist." He smiled like he'd just told her something clever. "Makes one wonder what else about you is fiction." He walked away before she could respond, which meant there was no response he was waiting for. He already had what he came for, the knowledge that he'd gotten under her skin, that he'd identified something false in her credentials and could exploit it. He didn't need to know what that falseness was. He just needed to know it was there. Natalie's pen didn't waver. She finished typing the note with the same precise keystrokes, the same exact documentation style she'd maintained for 2 years. But her other hand, the one hidden below the desk, clenched so tight her fingernails drew small crescents of blood from her palm. She released it. She'd need that hand steady. What happened next would depend entirely on her ability to keep everything locked down. The Ranger's vitals shifted at 2:15 p.m. the next day. Natalie was monitoring him closely by then, too closely, as if her attention alone could keep him stable. His respiratory rate climbed from 18 to 24 to 28, his oxygen saturation dropping despite the ventilator running at 40% oxygen. She increased the FiO2 to 50% and paged the on-call resident. By 4 p.m., things were deteriorating in the way that critical care only deteriorates when time is already running out. His neck veins distended like they might burst through the skin. His trachea was deviating left. His chest wall was rising asymmetrically, one side climbing while the other barely moved. Tension pneumothorax. The on-call resident was Chen, first year, and his hand shook as he reached for his phone to call Dr. Pierce. Natalie watched him dial, watched him explain the presentation, and she knew they had minutes. Maybe less. She'd seen this exact thing in a transport helicopter outside Kandahar with rounds coming through the fuselage. She'd done needle decompression in a field hospital in Bagram with incoming fire shaking the walls. She'd performed the procedure in the back of an MRAP while the driver pushed 45 miles per hour across terrain that wanted to kill them. The Ranger's oxygen saturation hit 84%. Chen was still on the phone with Pierce's office. Natalie opened the sterile needle decompression kit. Her hands moved through the procedure with muscle memory that had survived 2 years of invisibility intact, finding the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the needle entering at exactly the right angle. The needle slid through skin and muscle and found the pressurized air pocket. The hiss was immediate. Pressure releasing. Like opening a door that had been sealed too long. The Ranger's saturation started climbing. 85, 88. 92, his chest wall evened out. His color changed from the particular shade of gray that meant hypoxia to something almost human again. Chen stared at her like she'd just levitated off the ground. That was when Dr. Pierce walked through the door. The monitor alarm split the silence like a siren. 3 seconds before 9 a.m. on day 3, the ranger's oxygen saturation began its catastrophic descent. 94. 91. 88. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but the air wasn't reaching his lungs. Natalie was at the medication cart when she heard it, that particular quality of silence that follows a code alert, the kind where everyone knows something is going wrong and nobody's moving fast enough to stop it. She was moving before her conscious mind finished the math. The on-call resident, a third-year named Dr. Chen with the trembling hands of someone who'd seen 3 codes in his entire career, stood frozen at the bedside. His eyes were locked on the monitor. 85. The ranger's chest wasn't rising. The ventilator was pushing air into a collapsed lung. Tension pneumothorax, Natalie said. Not a question. The clinical picture was perfect: sudden decompensation, no air entry on the right side, JVD distending like cords of rope, trachea already shifting. We need needle decompression. Now. Chen looked at her like she'd spoken a language he'd never heard. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The monitor counted down 82. 79. Natalie didn't wait for him to find his voice. She moved to the supply cart with the economy of motion that came from having done this before, not in a hospital, but in the back of a Chinook helicopter screaming toward Kandahar with a Marine whose lung had collapsed from shrapnel. Her hands knew the geography of this procedure the way other people knew how to tie their shoes. 14-gauge angiocath. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Direct path to the pleural space, the trapped air that was crushing the ranger's heart, stealing his oxygen, murdering him 1 second at a time. She didn't ask. She didn't apologize. She simply moved. The ranger's ribs were steady under her fingertips, second rib, the space below it, the landmarks of anatomy that had nothing to do with rank or credentials or hospital hierarchies. Her other hand positioned the needle. She felt the subtle give as it pierced the fascia. There, that particular resistance of puncturing the pleural membrane. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a held breath finally released. 75 on the monitor. 78. 81. Climbing. She didn't remove her eyes from the ranger's chest as his color shifted from slate gray to something approximating human. The mechanical ventilator found purchase now, the air actually reaching lung tissue. She secured the angiocath with the efficiency of someone who'd done this under fire, under rain, under circumstances where hesitation meant a body bag and a letter to someone's mother. 88. 90. 92. The door opened. Dr. Pierce stood in the frame for exactly 3 seconds. Natalie saw the progression move across his face like weather systems crossing a map, confusion, then recognition of what he was witnessing, then a cold fury that seemed to drop the room temperature 15 degrees. He stepped inside. What the hell do you think you're doing? Natalie stepped back from the bed, her hands already reaching for the patient chart. Her breathing was steady as a surgical laser. Her voice came out level as concrete. Tension pneumothorax. Patient was decompensating. Performed needle decompression at second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Pierce looked at Chen. Did you authorize this? Chen's voice came out as a whisper. No. No, I was going to, she just. You just what? Pierce's attention returned to Natalie like a spotlight burning through darkness. You just performed medicine without a license? In front of a witness? In front of this resident who will be my corroborating statement. Natalie wrote the procedure time, 9:04 a.m. She documented the needle gauge. She noted the immediate improvement in oxygenation. Every movement was precise. Every notation was correct. The patient was breathing. The patient was alive. Everything else was noise. The patient is stable, she said. Her voice carried the tone of someone discussing weather. You can verify the procedure was indicated and performed correctly. Pierce wasn't listening. He'd already pulled out his phone. She recognized the expression, the satisfaction of a man who'd been handed exactly the weapon he needed. He stepped into the hallway, and she heard him start to dial. First call came through in under 30 seconds. The hospital board chairman. Yes, I have a serious situation. No, it can't wait. His voice dropped to that particular register reserved for people who knew they had leverage. I need a formal investigation opened immediately. One of the nursing staff just practiced medicine without a license in front of a witness. The credentials are fraudulent, we can't verify her references, and frankly, the whole background smells like a construction. No, I have no idea who hired her. Yes, I'm filing a formal complaint with the state board right now. Natalie continued documenting. The second call came while she was still writing, the state nursing board. His voice was different here, a veneer of professionalism over something sharp enough to cut. I need to file an emergency complaint against a registered nurse at Seattle General. Name is Natalie Hayes. Charge, practicing medicine without a license. I have a witness. I have documentation. Yes, I'll wait for your investigation team. The ranger's oxygen saturation held at 94. His blood pressure had stabilized. His pupils were reactive. Everything she'd done was correct, and everything she'd done was, according to hospital protocol and state law, impossible for her to do. Pierce's third call was to someone he kept on retainer, a private investigator, his voice suggested, because he used a first name without preamble. I want a background check completed by tomorrow morning. Name, Natalie Hayes. RN at Seattle General. I need verification on every reference, every credential, every previous employer. I want to know if those are real phone numbers or if they go to voicemail boxes that haven't been checked since 2019. Yes, I know it's expensive. Bill me. He paused. And I want to know who trained her. Because whatever she just did, that wasn't nursing school. That was military training. The fluorescent light above the ranger's bed buzzed its steady electric song. The ventilator wheezed. The monitors beeped their rhythm. Natalie finished her documentation and clipped the chart back to the bed rail. Pierce appeared in the doorway again, phone still in hand, expression like a man holding for aces. You should have stayed invisible, he said quietly. Now let's see how long you stay employed. By 6 p.m., Natalie was sitting in the director of nursing's office. Her hospital badge lay on the desk between them like evidence at a crime scene. The director, a woman named Morrison who'd never once bothered to learn Natalie's first name in 2 years, looked exhausted in the way of people who'd just spent 8 hours on the phone with lawyers. Dr. Pierce has filed a formal complaint, Morrison said. Her fingers drummed against the laminate desk. The board is demanding immediate suspension pending investigation. Your references. She pulled up her computer screen. Natalie could see the numbers there, the disconnected lines, the voicemail boxes that had never existed, the previous employers who existed only in classified databases that Morrison didn't have clearance to access. We can't reach any of them. I've been on the phone for 3 hours. Your previous employment verification numbers go to disconnected lines. Your credential review shows gaps. Natalie said nothing. I need you to explain this to me, Morrison continued. Because Dr. Pierce is suggesting your entire background is fraudulent. Which would make you someone who committed identity fraud to work at a hospital. Which would make you a criminal. Which would make you my liability. Natalie couldn't explain. Couldn't say that every reference was a CIA handler who'd been disappeared into a new identity in 2019. Couldn't say that her entire employment history before Seattle General was classified at levels Morrison didn't have clearance to know existed. Couldn't say that her credentials were real and her background was a construct and that she'd saved a man's life today in direct violation of every protocol designed to keep people like her invisible. I can't, Natalie said. Morrison reached for the badge. Your suspension is effective immediately. We'll contact you once the investigation concludes. By 6:33 p.m., security had walked her to her locker. A man named Eric, who'd worked the same shift rotation for 18 months without ever making eye contact with her, held a cardboard box and watched as she emptied her life out of the space. The photograph of her unit at Bagram. The compass with the needle that never quite pointed true. The ranger's ring she'd meant to log into evidence but had kept, instead, in the small pocket of her scrub jacket where nobody asked questions. The folded flag she'd taken from his belongings, red and white and blue, the flag from a fallen teammate, the same one she'd carried for 3 years after the operation that erased her existence. All of it fit into a box you could carry with one hand. By 7 p.m., she was walking through the parking lot in rain that fell like a judgment. The October air smelled of wet asphalt and diesel exhaust from the ambulances arriving without her. Above her, the Seattle General sign glowed electric blue in the darkness, the building where she'd spent 2 years learning the art of disappearing, where she'd kept her hand steady and her head down, where she'd become good enough at being invisible that nobody noticed when the most important person at the hospital was the one they'd stopped looking for long ago. The box wasn't heavy. It was the absence of weight that killed her, the light, easy nothing of having nowhere to go and no one to be. Then her phone rang. The number on the screen was blocked. She almost didn't answer. Almost kept walking through the rain toward a parking lot where her 10-year-old Subaru waited like a getaway vehicle. Almost let it go to voicemail with all the other calls that had meant nothing for 2 years. She answered anyway. Captain Hayes. The voice was male, military-trained, speaking with the precision of someone who'd spent 20 years giving orders that killed people. This is Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Graves with the Defense Intelligence Agency. We need to talk about your medical discharge. Natalie stood in the rain with a cardboard box in one hand and a phone in the other, and she understood in that moment that invisibility had an expiration date, and hers had just expired. Within an hour of the needle decompression, while the ranger's oxygen saturation climbed to acceptable levels and his breathing finally stabilized, Dr. Pierce made 3 phone calls from his office on the 3rd floor. The first was to Hospital Board Chairman Richard Ashford, a man who'd hired Pierce 8 years ago and owed him favors from a malpractice case where Pierce's testimony had saved Ashford's liability exposure $500,000. Pierce didn't waste time with pleasantries. His voice came smooth as diesel oil. We have a critical situation. One of my ICU nurses just performed an unauthorized medical procedure, needle decompression, without physician order or supervision. I witnessed it myself. This is exactly the kind of incident that destroys institutional credibility. Ashford listened. Pierce continued. I'm not looking to destroy her career, but we need immediate action. Suspension pending investigation. Her documentation shows gaps, training inconsistencies. I'm concerned about patient safety across her entire caseload. The second call went to the State Board of Nursing Licensing Division. Pierce introduced himself as the attending physician overseeing the care of the patient in question. His tone carried the weight of someone reporting a safety violation, not settling a score. I need to file a formal complaint regarding one of your licensees, Natalie Hayes, RN. Unsafe practice. I have documentation of her performing emergency procedures outside her scope, and frankly, her entire credential file has raised questions about her initial training requirements. He spelled her name carefully. Gave her license number. The third call was to a private investigator in Richmond who specialized in background verification for medical institutions. I need you to contact 3 references listed on a nurse's application file. Check their availability, verify they actually trained this person. I'm concerned the credentials might be fabricated. He provided the names, all fictional, all part of the CIA construction that had made Natalie Hayes exist in the civilian world. The investigator would call those numbers. Nobody would answer. Messages would go unreturned. The references would simply not exist. By noon, the Board of Nursing complaint was logged as a formal incident. By 2 p.m., Ashford had authorized a personnel investigation. By 4 p.m., the private investigator reported back that 2 of the 3 references were unreachable, and the third phone number belonged to a disconnected business line. Red flags. Documentation gaps. Procedure violations. A pattern that looked, on paper, like fraud. At 6:24 p.m., security arrived at Natalie's locker with a supervisor and a manila envelope containing her termination papers. Her badge was deactivated with 3 keystrokes. Her access to the ICU was revoked. The locker that had held her clothes, her shoes, her paperwork for 2 years was emptied into a cardboard box, tan, dented on one corner, the kind of box that smelled like photocopier paper and shipping tape. She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She simply took the box and walked past the fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead like insects trapped in resin, past the nurse's station where no one would meet her eyes, past the waiting room where 2 families sat in that particular hospital silence that meant someone was dying or already dead. The rain started the moment she reached the parking lot, not a drizzle but a full assault, water hammering the asphalt like applause for a performance she'd never wanted to give. She sat in her car for 40 minutes, the cardboard box on the passenger seat, the rain running down the windshield in rivers, before she drove to the Granby Street Diner on the edge of Norfolk, the kind of place that stays open at 3 a.m. because the regulars have nowhere else to be. The waitress was kind enough not to ask questions when Natalie ordered coffee and a water and sat in a booth by the window. She'd stopped refilling the coffee an hour ago, sensing that this wasn't about caffeine. This was about a woman sitting in a public place because going home to an apartment that wasn't even rented in her own name felt impossible. The coffee had gone cold. A film had formed on the surface. The cardboard box sat on the seat beside her like an accusation, a judgment, a summary of everything she'd tried to build in 2 years of careful, invisible work. Natalie stared at her reflection in the window, not quite 34, not quite young, certainly not innocent. 22 years old when she'd enlisted. 24 when she made captain. 32 when the Pentagon told her she had to disappear. 34 now, sitting in a diner at 3 a.m. watching a stranger's face stare back at her from the Rain Street glass. She'd lost her first identity in a combat operation outside Bagram that would never be declassified. She'd lost her second identity tonight in a hospital where she'd tried to save a stranger's life and discovered that courage, no matter how quietly executed, always comes with a price. She reached into her purse and pulled out 2 objects. The first was the Ranger's ring, the 75th Ranger Regiment insignia, the date engraved inside matching the operation that had erased her existence. The second was the folded flag she'd found in his effects when she was cleaning his belongings for transfer, the flag that had belonged to his fallen teammate, the one she'd kept safe in her locker for 3 days because something in her understood that losing your identity meant losing everything that connected you to other people. She set both on the table and stared at them like they were evidence at a crime scene. The ring caught the fluorescent light from above the diner booth. The flag was olive green, crisp from careful folding, the kind of precision that only comes from military hands. At 4 a.m., Natalie made a decision that would either be heroic or suicidal, and she'd learned long enough ago that the difference between those 2 things was usually just timing. She left cash on the table, picked up the cardboard box with one hand and the flag with the other, and drove back to Seattle General. The emergency entrance side door had been broken for months, a maintenance issue she'd reported 3 times, once per month, watching the work order get pushed to the bottom of the queue each time. The lock mechanism didn't catch properly. The door swung open to the sound of rubber seals releasing, and she slipped through into the hallway that smelled like antiseptic and something else, something deeper, like the particular exhaustion that settles into hospital walls at 4 a.m. She moved through the corridors she knew better than her own apartment, avoiding the security camera angles the way a sniper avoids skylining. Muscle memory took over. 8 years of military training, 2 years of learning a hospital's architecture and its blind spots, all of it converging into a single purpose: get to the 4th floor, return the flag, disappear. The Ranger's room was dark except for the glow of the heart monitor, the ventilator's steady wheeze like an animal breathing in the corner, the 4 lines running clear fluid into his arm. She stepped toward the bed to leave the flag on his nightstand and froze. The room was not empty. The room was full. 2 men in suits with federal credentials clipped to their belts. A Marine colonel in dress blues, silver eagles on his shoulder boards, leaning against the wall like he had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to wait. 3 more agents with DOD credentials. And standing beside the bed, close enough to touch the ranger's shoulder, wearing Afghan civilian clothes that hung wrong on his frame, cotton shalwar kameez on someone whose muscle memory belonged to operations, not tailoring, was a face Natalie had last seen through rifle sights outside Bagram in 2019. Khalid Nazari, Taliban intelligence officer. Captured. Treated. Interrogated. Now apparently working for the United States government as an intelligence asset. His eyes met hers. Recognition sparked across his face like a flare going up. He stepped forward, his hand extended, his English carrying a thick Pashto accent but clear as satellite radio. The Angel of Bagram. The ghost medic. The room went silent. Not the silence of respect or politeness. The silence of everyone stopping mid-breath. Every head turned. For federal agents. One Marine colonel. One Taliban asset turned CIA informant. All of them staring at a woman in a diner uniform holding a cardboard box and her terminated employment like evidence. She walked past security at 11 a.m. with her cardboard box still under one arm and the folded flag tucked inside her jacket. The emergency department was quiet, that suspended moment between the graveyard shift's final crisis and the day team's arrival. Her badge was deactivated. Her locker was emptied. By every measure, she no longer existed here. But she had promised Marcus Webb a flag, and promises were the only currency that mattered anymore. The ICU corridor smelled like antiseptic and something else, something metallic that came after midnight, after the real bleeding started. Her boots moved soundlessly against the tile. Third floor. West wing. Room for 12. She could navigate this place in absolute darkness. She had memorized it cell by cell, the way soldiers memorize patrol routes. Invisible. Safe. Until she reached the ranger's room and found it full of federal agents. They stood in formation, 3 in dark suits, 1 in marine dress blues with silver eagles on his collar, and a man in civilian clothes whose face belonged to a memory she'd spent 2 years burying. Khalid Nazari. Taliban commander turned CIA asset. The same man she'd treated in a field hospital outside Bagram while rounds snapped past her helmet, his shoulder wound bleeding arterial, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, saving the life of someone who'd been trying to kill her 30 minutes earlier. Because that's what medics did. Battlefield neutrality. Save everyone. Ask questions after the bleeding stopped. Khalid's eyes widened. He pointed. His voice came out as a whisper in Pashto, then English, then both at once like his mind couldn't find the right language for what he was seeing. Angel of Bagram. The ghost medic. You are alive. You are. He stopped. His hand moved to his chest in the traditional greeting, fingers splayed over his heart. Salamu alaikum, Captain. Everything went still. The Marine colonel turned. His eyes tracked from Khalid to Natalie, then down to the cardboard box under her arm. He pulled a tablet from the desk beside the ranger's bed, Marcus Webb. She could see the name now on the whiteboard, the first name she'd ever let herself know, and he read from a classified file that should not exist in Norfolk, should not exist anywhere outside a Pentagon vault. Captain Natalie Hayes, the colonel said. His voice was precise, military measured, the kind of voice that made decisions about life and death. Senior combat medic, 75th Ranger Regiment. Attached to JSOC Task Force 121, Bagram Airfield, 2019 through 2021. Citation for Extraordinary Valor, June 14, 2021. He looked up from the tablet. During a direct action raid on a Taliban compound in Logar province, Captain Hayes remained in the open under sustained enemy fire to treat for critically wounded Rangers, preventing exsanguination on 3 of them while coordinating medical evacuation under fire. She also rendered emergency medical aid to a wounded detainee, later identified as an intelligence asset of significant value. No one was left behind. No one died on her watch. The words hung there like bullets suspended mid-air. The door pushed open. Dr. Pierce stood in the frame, his voice already loaded and ready. This woman is not authorized to be in this hospital. She was terminated yesterday for practicing medicine without a license. I demand she be arrested immediately for. A two-star general stepped forward from the corner of the room where he'd been standing so quietly that Natalie hadn't even registered his presence until now. He was older, his uniform hung with medals, his presence making the air pressure change like a barometric shift before a storm. He raised his hand in salute. Not the casual kind. The kind given to rank held and respect earned. He was saluting her. "Captain," the general said. "Your silver star and purple heart, I believe." Two objects sat on the desk beside Marcus Webb's monitor. Her combat medic's shears with her call sign engraved on the metal, Angel 6, lay beside a small velvet box. She'd kept them in her locker for 2 years. Hidden. Evidence of a life that had been classified, erased, reassigned to a file that required presidential-level clearance to access. Dr. Pierce's voice climbed an octave. "Street theater. This is clearly some kind of elaborate." His phone rang. The ringtone cut through the room like a scalpel. Pierce looked at the caller ID. His face drained of color in stages. He answered. The voice on the other end was distant, but Natalie could hear its tone, clipped, furious, the sound of someone whose entire institutional foundation had become sand. "Your privileges are suspended immediately," the voice said. "Hospital board chairman." Natalie recognized him from the emergency meetings she'd observed from the hallway. "The board will convene tomorrow morning. The video has 300,000 views. Our legal team is in crisis mode." The line went dead. Pierce stood there, phone lowered, and tried again. This is clearly coordination. This woman was fired for cause. She performed unauthorized medical procedures. "I have a witness." "You have a resident," the Marine colonel said quietly. Chen, the first-year resident standing in the corner, stepped forward with his shoulders straight and his voice shaking but resolute. "Dr. Pierce ordered me to observe only." The patient was crashing. Sinus rhythm flat. She performed needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Without her intervention, he would have died. I watched him. I documented it. I have nothing to hide. Pierce's phone began buzzing. Once. Twice. A third time. Text messages. More calls. More notifications. The viral video climbing. Nurse advocacy groups. Medical ethics boards. Former patients suddenly finding courage in the outline of his cruelty, sharing their own stories in comments and shares and replies. Power that had seemed absolute 2 hours earlier was dissolving like salt in water. A federal agent's phone rang. He listened, nodded, disconnected. His eyes moved to Dr. Pierce with the same precision that predators used to identify prey. "Dr. Pierce, the FBI would like to ask you some questions about billing irregularities flagged by CMS. Particularly regarding cardiac equipment purchases from Pierce Medical Supply LLC. His brother-in-law's company. The kickback scheme Natalie had documented in her head during those 2 years of invisibility. The unnecessary procedures on Medicare patients. The phantom charges. The evidence she'd never reported because reporting would have meant revealing herself, and revelation meant extraction, and extraction meant this life, this careful constructed identity, would evaporate like morning fog. She'd stayed silent. And now silence was no longer an option. The general turned to face her directly. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions made in rooms she would never see, at briefing tables with satellite imagery and threat assessments and names classified beyond her clearance level. "Captain Hayes, the Pentagon would like to offer you a position heading a new Veterans Trauma Unit. Seattle General has agreed to provide space and basic staffing. Full operational funding, full autonomy, your rank reinstated for retirement purposes. You would answer to no one but the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations and your own conscience." Natalie was still holding the Ranger's ring. She looked at Marcus Webb lying unconscious in the bed, the man who'd taken her job, who wore her unit patch, who got wounded doing the exact work she'd been forced to abandon when the Pentagon made her disappear. "Will he make it?" she asked. The Marine colonel nodded. Thanks to you, yes. Stable since your intervention. Walter Reed transport tomorrow for specialized care. Full recovery expected. The room's pressure shifted again. Khalid Nazari took one step forward, placing his hand over his heart in that traditional greeting of respect. The ghost medic returns. Some debts can never be repaid. But Afghanistan will remember. I will remember. Dr. Pierce was escorted out by hospital security while still holding his phone, still trying to make calls that nobody answered. His voice followed him down the corridor. This is not over, this is completely, until the elevator doors closed and cut him off from everything he thought he'd built. The general gestured toward the folded flag. I believe that belongs to someone. Natalie reached into her jacket and withdrew the colors. The folded triangle, neat and precise, representing the teammate Marcus had lost, the debt of survival that every soldier carries, the weight that doesn't get lighter with time. She placed it gently beside him on the bed, positioning it so he would see it when he woke. I need to make a call, she said. Her voice had changed. The deferential tone was gone. What remained was the voice of someone who'd spent 2 years waiting for permission and finally decided to stop asking. I need to assemble a team. Combat medics transitioning to civilian medicine. Army nurses who understand what happens in the dark. Done, the general said. Pentagon will handle recruitment. You focus on design. What do you need? Natalie looked around the room. Federal agents and Marine officers and a Taliban asset turned CIA informant, all standing together because one patient mattered and one nurse had refused to stay disappeared. Everything, she said. I need everything. If you've ever been invisible, if you've ever done the right thing with no recognition, no acknowledgement, no proof you'd ever existed, you understand what happens next. You understand what it means to be told you finally get to exist again. Subscribe to see what Captain Natalie Hayes builds when she stops hiding. Like this video if you believe the quietest people in the room might just be the ones holding it all together. And comment, would you have walked away, or would you have returned?